Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. And today we're going to take a look at this kind of unusual situation with Nancy Pelosi.
Yeah.
You know, she's in the news this week, not so much for anything political, but because she got injured on a trip over in Luxembourg
Right.
to commemorate the, 80th anniversary of the Battle of the Bulge. And, at first glance, you might think, well, this is just a little news blip.
Right.
And I think it kind of brings up some bigger questions about, aging politicians and just the demands of these really high-profile jobs.
Yeah.
Especially because this is happening, just a couple of days after Mitch McConnell also had a fall?
Yeah, it's definitely, I think it's caught a lot of people's attention, and it's kind of interesting how this seemingly isolated event with Pelosi's injury sort of shines a light on this thing that's been kind of bubbling under the surface for a while.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got all these news reports to look at, and I'm really curious to, first of all, try to figure out what exactly happened to her, and then kind of zoom out and see if we can get a handle on this whole, age and politics debate that's kind of coming up again.
Yeah.
You know?
All right, let's take a look at the Pelosi thing first and see what we can actually find out about what happened.
Yeah, so that's where it starts to get a little interesting, right? Because her spokesperson is not saying a lot.
Right.
All they've said is that she sustained an injury and she had to go to the hospital to get checked out, and that she's getting excellent treatment and she's still working. But that's it.
Wow.
And, one source did say that she, tripped and fell at an event.
Yeah.
But beyond that, there are no details.
It makes you wonder, though, right? Is this something minor that they're just choosing to keep private?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it something maybe more serious? I think the lack of transparency just fuels speculation.
Yeah.
And especially after the thing with McConnell, it's kind of understandable that people are making connections and maybe jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. And she's 84 years old. So that kind of automatically raises the stakes a little bit. I've seen a lot of comments online where people are like, these are the people making huge decisions for the country. Shouldn't we know more about their health?
Mm-hmm.
And some are even going so far as to say that we need mandatory retirement ages for politicians, which is a whole other,
Oh, wow.
can of worms. But
Right. Yeah, that's a really potent question.
yeah.
Should there be an upper age limit for holding office? It's interesting to look at how other countries handle this.
Mm-hmm.
Some countries have mandatory retirement ages for judges, for instance.
Yeah.
But in the U.S., it always gets kind of tangled up with this idea of individual rights and age discrimination.
Right. It's not as easy as just picking a number.
Right.
But it does seem like this thing with Pelosi might force a more open discussion about how we decide whether someone is fit for these jobs that are so demanding. And what I'm kind of curious about is, historically speaking, have we always had older leaders, or is this a new thing?
That's a great question, because the current Congress actually is one of the oldest in U.S. history.
Oh, wow.
But it's not totally new.
Okay.
There have been times when the average age of politicians has been high, but what seems different now is just how much power is concentrated in the hands of people who are in their late 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
If you think about the key players, not just in Congress, but across the government and even in business, it does kind of raise the question of whether this actually reflects the demographics of the country, the concerns of younger generations.
Yeah, that's a really important point. And it makes me wonder, if we do have this concentration of older leaders, does that affect the kind of policies that they focus on?
Yeah.
Do younger generations have different needs that aren't being addressed?
That's where it gets really interesting.
Right.
So let's put Pelosi's injury aside for a minute and just think bigger picture. What happens when the people making most of the decisions are so much older than a lot of the people they're representing?
Yeah. And I'm ready to get into that. Yeah.
And I'm especially curious about, is there any research on how age affects political views or how people make decisions?
Yeah.
Do we know anything concrete about that?
There is research that looks at, how age and political attitudes are connected. It's complicated, but there are some patterns. For example, studies suggest that when people get older, they tend to be more risk averse.
Okay.
And their priorities can shift a bit.
Interesting.
Maybe they're more focused on keeping things the way they are instead of making big changes.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can see how that could create tension, especially when it comes to things like climate change or technology, where younger generations might feel like we need to act more boldly and urgently.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
And when those voices aren't really being heard by the people making the decisions, you can see how that could lead to frustration and people feeling disillusioned. For sure. So we're starting to see some of the potential downsides of having this aging political class. But before we jump to conclusions, I think it's important to remember that experience isn't always a bad thing.
Right.
I mean, there's definitely value in having leaders who've seen things, who've dealt with complicated situations before.
Absolutely. Experience brings a depth of understanding that's really hard to just, replicate.
Right.
Think about someone like Pelosi, who's been a major player in Washington for decades.
Yeah.
She has so much institutional knowledge. She understands how things work in politics or how they don't work sometimes, which is just as important.
Yeah.
That could be super valuable, especially when there's a crisis or when they need to work out really difficult deals.
Right. So it sounds like it's all about finding the right balance.
Yeah.
Experience on one side and the need for fresh perspectives on the other. But how do we actually do that? How do we make sure that both experience and new ideas are represented?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's what we're going to explore next.
Yeah, it really is the question, right? Like, how do you make a system that gets the benefit of all that experience, but also stays, relevant and responsive to what's going on now and, thinking about the future, too?
Yeah, and doing it in a way that doesn't feel like you're pitting one generation against another.
Right.
This isn't about old versus young. It's about trying to make things work better for everyone.
Right, exactly. And one way to think about this is through the lens of representation.
Okay.
And not just age representation, but making sure that you've got different viewpoints and different experiences reflected in in the people who are making decisions.
Right.
A true democracy really thrives on that kind of back and forth of ideas, or everyone having a say.
Okay, I'm with you. So if we're looking at this bigger question of representation,
Yeah.
how do we move beyond just talking about it to actually making changes?
Right.
What are the things we can actually do?
Well, there are a couple of things to think about.
Yeah.
One is campaign finance reform.
The truth is, running for office, especially at the national level, takes a ton of money.
Yeah.
And that can really make it hard for younger candidates who might not have the same access to wealth or, those established networks of donors.
Right. So leveling the playing field when it comes to money could help bring in some fresh faces and new ideas.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. But money's not the only obstacle, right? There's also that whole insider game of politics, all the connections and networks that can take years to build.
You're right. That's where mentorship comes in.
Okay.
We need to see more, seasoned politicians who are really actively mentoring and supporting younger candidates. And it shouldn't matter what party they're from.
Yeah.
It's about creating this culture of passing on knowledge,
Right.
where experience is shared and the next generation is ready to step up.
I like the idea of knowledge transfer.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we're all in this together and that we need to be investing in the future, But let's be real for a second. There can be a lot of resistance to change.
Yeah.
Especially in these systems that have been around for so long. People in power don't always want to give up their seats at the table.
That's a fair point, and that's where we as citizens have a really important role to play.
Okay.
We need to hold our elected officials accountable,
Mm-hmm.
demand transparency, ask them tough questions about how they're meeting the needs of all generations, and if they're not listening, we need to be willing to support candidates who are more in tune with our priorities.
Okay, so we're talking about voting, getting involved in campaigns, maybe even running for office ourselves.
Yeah.
But I think there's something even bigger going on here. It's not just about changing who's in Congress. It's about changing how we think about aging and leadership in general.
That's a great point. We live in a culture that often connects youth with, dynamism and success.
Yeah.
It's almost like there's this expiration date on ambition and being relevant.
Right.
And that mindset not only ignores what older people can contribute, but it also limits the chances for younger people to take on leadership roles.
It's like we're stuck in this cycle where experience is valuable, but only up to a point.
Right.
And then it's like, okay, time to step aside. It's the next generation's turn.
Yeah.
But it's not that simple. We need both.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that different stages of life offer different strengths and different perspectives.
Right.
Younger generations might be better at understanding technology or the unique challenges they're facing, while older folks bring, a deep understanding of history and a whole network of relationships, and they often have a more, a better grasp of how to work within complex systems.
Okay, I'm with you. We need both. But how do we actually break free from these ideas that are so ingrained in our society?
Right.
It's one thing to talk about it, but changing deeply held beliefs and attitudes is hard.
It is challenging, but I don't think it's impossible.
Okay.
It starts with awareness.
Yeah.
Recognizing our own biases and what we assume about age and leadership. Are we dismissing someone's ideas because they're too young or they're out of touch? Or are we writing someone off because they're older and we think they're not open to change?
Yeah.
We have to actively challenge those automatic ways of thinking.
That's so important, being more aware of how ageism can sneak into our thoughts.
Right.
And beyond just individual awareness, what about systemic solutions?
Yeah.
Are there policies or programs that could help bridge this gap between generations and encourage more collaboration?
There are. And one place where this is really relevant is the workplace.
Okay.
More and more companies are seeing the value of having teams with people from different generations.
Interesting.
They're creating environments where people share knowledge and mentor each other, and they can use those different perspectives to their advantage. That same idea could apply to government, too.
So like think tanks or advisory panels that intentionally bring together people of different ages and backgrounds to work on specific problems. That could be really powerful, especially when you're dealing with complicated issues that need fresh thinking, but also a deep understanding of how things have worked in the past.
Right. It's about creating spaces where experience and innovation can come together and come up with new solutions.
Yeah.
And it's not just about policies and programs. It's also about how the media portrays things.
Okay.
How often do we see older people being shown as active and engaged members of society?
Right. Yeah.
Are we telling stories that show the value of experience and wisdom?
You're so right. The media plays a huge role in shaping how we see things.
Yeah.
If all we see are stereotypes of, frail, out of touch older people or naive, impulsive young people, then that just reinforces those limited beliefs.
Right.
We need to see more diversity and more nuanced portrayals of age and leadership in the stories we tell.
Absolutely. And this brings us back to Nancy Pelosi's injury.
Yeah.
We can speculate all we want about the details, but there's no denying that it sparked a lot of concern and discussion about age and whether people are fit for office.
Right.
And I don't think that's a bad thing.
I agree. It's a chance to have a more open and honest conversation about these issues.
Yeah.
But we need to be careful not to make it all about Pelosi herself
Right.
or any individual politician's health.
Yeah. It's about the system as a whole.
Okay.
Are we setting up our leaders for success?
Mm-hmm.
Are we giving them the support and resources they need to do well in these really demanding jobs, no matter how old they are? And are we creating pathways for the next generation of leaders to step up and bring their talents and perspectives to the table?
Those are really important questions, and I think they go way beyond just politics.
Yeah.
They're about how we value experience and wisdom as a society.
Exactly. This isn't just about who's in the Oval Office, who's in Congress.
Right.
It's about how we create a society that recognizes and uses the strengths of every generation.
It's pretty amazing, isn't it? This whole thing with Pelosi falling has really brought up all these questions about age and leadership and experience and how we prepare for what's coming next.
It really has. Yeah, it's like we've been kind of avoiding these topics and now it's right in our faces.
Yeah.
And I think that's good. We need to talk about these things, even if they're uncomfortable.
Right. But I keep thinking about balance. We've talked about the value of experience and needing new ideas and making sure everyone's represented. But how do we actually get that balance? Is there some kind of secret formula for making sure our leaders reflect how diverse our society is and that they can actually handle the challenges of, the 21st century and all that?
I don't think there's like a one-size-fits-all answer.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I do think there are some principles we can use. Like one is this idea of continuous learning.
Okay.
But we usually think of learning as something young people do.
Right.
But really, we should be learning and adapting throughout our whole lives.
Mm-hmm.
And that's especially important for leaders because they need to stay on top of all these changes with technology and global stuff and how society is changing.
Right. So it's not just enough to rely on what you've done in the past.
Yeah.
Leaders need to be actively trying to grow their knowledge base, seeking out new information and challenging their own assumptions.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a mental fitness routine, keeping their minds sharp and flexible.
Exactly.
I like that. A growth mindset for leaders.
Yeah.
It makes me think about how we often praise the leaders who seem like they have all the answers.
Right.
The ones who project this image of total confidence. But maybe what we really need are leaders who are okay with saying they don't know everything.
Yeah.
Leaders who are willing to ask questions and who are always trying to learn and grow.
That's a really powerful shift in how we see things.
Yeah.
And it connects to another important principle, collaboration.
Okay.
We love the idea of the lone heroic leader, the one who solves all the problems and always makes the right call.
Yeah.
But the truth is, leadership in this day and age is more about working together.
Okay.
about bringing in different perspectives and finding solutions as a team.
Right. So moving away from that I know best
Yeah.
attitude to something more inclusive, where leaders are surrounded by people who challenge them and offer different viewpoints and bring a mix of skills and experiences to the table.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that no one person has all the answers,
Mm-hmm.
and that by welcoming different thoughts and experiences, we can come up with more creative and effective solutions.
Okay, I'm totally on board with these principles, continuous learning and collaboration.
Yeah,
But how do we make sure they're not just trendy words?
right.
How do they actually lead to real change in our political system?
Yeah, that's the hard part.
Yeah,
Systems don't like to change. They're built to keep things the same.
right.
But there are ways to kind of push them in the right direction.
Okay.
One is transparency and accountability.
Mm-hmm.
We need to demand that our leaders be more open about how they make decisions,
Okay.
where they get their information, and how willing they are to consider different viewpoints.
So basically shining a light on how decisions are being made, making sure there are ways to give feedback and make adjustments, and holding leaders accountable for creating an environment that's inclusive and collaborative.
Right, and this also means we need to change how we judge leadership.
Okay.
It's not just about experience or charisma.
Right.
It's about looking for people who embody these principles of continuous learning, collaboration, and adaptability.
So asking ourselves, is this someone who's actually curious? Are they willing to listen to and learn from others? Do they create an environment where different viewpoints are welcome and valued?
Yeah.
These are the things that are going to be crucial for navigating all the crazy stuff that's coming in the future.
It's not just about who's in charge, it's about what direction we're headed in.
Mm-hmm.
And to create a future that's more sustainable and fair and thriving, we need leaders who are ready to deal with the unknown, who are open to change, and who understand that the best solutions usually come from collective wisdom and working together.
That's a great way to put it. This whole conversation has been so insightful.
Yeah.
It feels like we went beyond just analyzing the news and got into some really fundamental questions about what leadership is all about.
It's been quite a deep dive, hasn't it?
It has. For our listeners, what I hope you take away from this is that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of leadership.
Right.
Whether it's through who we vote for, how we're involved in our communities, or the example we set in our own lives, we can all help create a world where leadership is less about power and more about service collaboration and really wanting to make a positive difference.
I agree with that. And maybe, just maybe, this whole thing that started with Nancy Pelosi's fall will end up being what we needed to change how we think about, choose, and support our leaders.
I hope so. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thanks.
Until next time, keep those minds open and those conversations going.